number one source, Sports Card Nation. The hobby is the people. Sports Card Nation.
What is up, everyone? Welcome to episode 359, Sports Card Nation. Headed to 400. It's funny. I remember approaching 200 episodes, 300 episodes, and now we're on the other side, closer to 400. And when you think about it being a weekly show, that's crazy. Here we are, 7 years later, just about. So, just a little short of 7 years. But enough about that. Let's talk about, one house cleaning thing. I've been a little quieter on social media than I traditionally am. Although I try to cut down on my social media use, this was kind of extreme, for, just to inflect a little bit of what's going on sort of outside the hobby. My mother-in-law lives in my house with me and my wife, and my son is here as well. And she had a medical emergency / scare. It was in the hospital 3 or 4 days, so we were going up back and forth there. And so she's home now. She's doing a lot better than she was, and 80 years old. God bless her. And so that was a reason where, the hobby and social media wasn't that important in the grand scheme of things. So I know a couple people actually asked, like, is everything okay? Because just not posting the same, algorithm, if you will, or as much. But just kind of wanted to put that out there. And but a lot better now, and here we are. So today's guest is an alumnus of the show. He's been on the show before, but it's been a bit. And when I realized how long it was since he was last on, I'm like, man, a lot has changed since then, and we've got to tackle a bunch of stuff. And my guest today is Gemrate's Ryan Stuczynski, and we're going to tackle the grading terrain, what's going on. And one thing I love about Ryan is not only does he do great work, and kudos to him for all the way he breaks all these numbers down and grading numbers, even by player and by company, and he's just added on to the information he puts out there for the hobby to digest. But one thing I love about Ryan too is he tells it like it is, even when he's on a show such as this. He doesn't mince words. He doesn't have play favorites. He gives sort of what he thinks is going on, or what he thinks may happen. Again, it's all speculation when we predict future events, right? But really, really, really forthcoming. Doesn't shy away from anything. Whenever, I've had him on twice now. He's like, ask me anything you want. There's nothing off base. So glad to have him on. And this is, again, part 1 of 2 with him. And he does great work. And his Gemrate report and now email, and he's just added so much to the repertoire. And I look forward to seeing, all those numbers. And, sometimes we get, paralysis by analysis, but the way he does it is just very, it's easy to understand, and tells a lot about the story of the hobby, if you will. So enough me doting on him. Let's speak to the man himself right now. Always excited to talk to the next gentleman on the Sports Card Nation guest line. It's been a couple years. When I looked that up, I was a little surprised and disappointed in myself. So let me start off with an apology. That's way too long not to have this next gentleman on the podcast with everything going on in the hobby. But glad to have him back, regardless of how long it's been. And I'll make a promise, Ryan Stuczynski, not to have it be that long of a wait for the next appearance. But Ryan from Gemrate, welcome back. Even though I made you wait a little bit too long, or at least in my.
John, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me back on.
Yeah, and with that being said, 2+ years since I've had you on. I mean, a lot's changed with what you do and what you produce with the Gemrate reports and all the work that you put into it. Like even back then, that it was a great thing, and you've just added so much more to it. Kind of speak to since the last time you've been on, like the evolution of Gemrate.
Yeah, I mean, big picture, just we're still doing the monthly reports, which do well. That gets sort of the most attention from just visibility from the Gemrate brand standpoint. And we're just continuing to sort of try to add value or sort of build on that. We do an iconic tracker report now every month, which is only an email. I don't post it to social. That does really well. But it's more about, if the monthly report is sort of known for the volume, it's kind of the fast food sort of equal of the hobby, which is just sort of like what's moving in and out. What are people grading at volume and at scale? And then we do this iconic tracker, which is more of like what of substance is moving in and out of the graders' doors as well. And that's just focused on sort of the cards of significance, who's seeing what's being graded the most, where is it being graded the most. That does well, and that's something that is only available on email. Just one of those things that tends to do really well there. Wasn't really sort of something on social that was doing quite as well, just because of sort of the presentation and also sort of the intended audience. And then we just started releasing within the last few months. We're starting to just venture into the sales world a little bit more. So we started to do data around what's sort of people are moving in and out of on eBay. So, we're not trying to do a pricing tool. We're not really trying to sort of compete on that front. We're just trying to provide another look from almost like a market research standpoint of just, if for example, $100 million was spent on eBay last month and $105 million were spent this month, where did that $5 million additional dollars go? What players are sort of getting more attention? What players maybe lost some, visibility in the hobby or sort of interest in the hobby? So that's a new report.
Sort of a stock up, stock down, if you will. I
Yep.
love it. I get that when you send it out, and I think it's great. I think it's an added enhanced feature, right? You can look at not just you're not getting a look at just what the companies are getting, but what specific athletes and people on the cards themselves are getting subbed, and where like you said, where the money is going, where people are, whether you people like the investment word or not, it's used and it's a thing. And so where are people putting their hard-earned dollars on what particular, and then where are they sort of taking that away and not doing that as much anymore? I think it's a great tool to see, and just again another feature you added on. I sorry to cut you off there, but I wanted to kind of chime in there because I love it. And was that something requested, or was that something like you just said, hey, I'm gonna add this on to my repertoire?
It just seemed like a white space. It seemed like, we have a little bit of a different way that we approach most of the hobby. We kind of do a very macro level sort of view of what's happening, where a lot of the pricing tools and stuff, just because of the nature of sort of the need they service, are very card oriented or very player oriented sort of from their inception. And this is much more of a just like big picture, where is money moving in the hobby? And I also, one of the things that's trickiest across, you just watch a lot of content where people are trying to compare players from different generations, or even a few years apart. A Prism Silver might be very different one year from the next, or a Topps flagship. There's things that change year to year that just make it hard to comp on a card level. And so this was sort of trying to help level the playing field of, hey, what's happening in somebody like an Aaron Judge or Otani's market versus what we're traditionally seeing with Griffey, or what we're traditionally seeing with Mickey Mantle, and just sort of makes things a little bit more apples to apples of just sort of like, where are people spending their dollars? How does that compare within a sort of certain sport or category, and then even across categories, like how does a Jordan compare to an Otani and things like that, or LeBron or Steph or somebody like that. So that was kind of the idea, just because of the way the other tools are built, they service a lot of great needs, and they do indexes and things like that, which are really valuable. This is just sort of a different approach to sort of say, hey, here's another way to sort of view important concepts in the hobby that's not really being presented today. We felt like we were uniquely suited to do it. And so it's still new. It's definitely like one that we're building momentum towards. But yeah, we were excited to bring it to market. It's been well received so far.
Yeah, and you 2 thumbs up for me, and kudos. I love reading that stuff, and it's funny. Most of my emails, you read them and then you delete them and they're
Mhm.
gone, right? The Gemrate ones I keep because I refer back to.
appreciate that.
Hey, well, I want to recheck that, or I think it was this, but let me verify that. So, like my work ones, they get deleted. The Gemrate ones
Right.
stay. I know I asked you this, the last time you were on, which again was a couple years back. And now with all the added stuff that you've added to your repertoire, I mean, has it gotten more difficult to do what you do, or how would you answer that? It's not necessarily, or depends on what's going on.
Not, I would say not more difficult than any other sort of hobby company. One of the hardest problems in this industry is just the card catalog continues to expand faster than sort of data tools can structure, the information. And so, there's just so many different products that are becoming increasingly more relevant, or, we're in sort of the junk parallel era where there's, hundreds of parallels for certain sets now for specific players and things. It's hard to catalog and sort of catch up. And so I just feel like we're sort of, playing this game where we're sort of never ever going to sort of be above water. We're always sort of underwater in this hobby. And I think so, it's not necessarily any easier, but it's also, we're fighting the same battle that most companies in space are. So, it's one that I knew I was signing up for though when I entered into it. I enjoy it, which is part of why I could sort of persevere through a lot of that noise. So, some things are easier, but I mean, we look at things too, like additional opportunities with like additional grading companies. We get a lot of requests to add tag to our data set, for example. And that's one that's sort of, emerging and interesting. And, they're a little niche in the sense that they're doing a lot of Pokemon these days. So even when we do get sort of close to being above water, we'll always throw something else onto the roadmap that's going to sink us right back down. And so, that's an example of something that we're looking to do in the next couple of months that, it's just going to sort of offset a lot of the momentum that we have if we're catching up, we'll sort of set ourselves back a little bit, but in a positive way. And that we're sort of incrementally adding to the data that we're bringing to market, but we're always sort of playing catch up.
Yeah, I like the term you used the last time you here, like organized chaos. You was the term you used, and I love it. I think I probably stolen it a couple times and used it in something I was doing in the context there. I know I asked you this last time too. Obviously, you're a bigger entity today than you were even when you were on a few years back. And I asked you this then. How are the grading companies themselves to work with? Have they sort of embraced what you're doing more now that it's become more hobby mainstream, if you will, more readily used and received, or not necessarily?
Yeah, for sure. We're definitely more, I think almost 5 years ago when we launched, I think our first report came out 4.5 years ago. People just weren't sure what to make of us. There's a lot of, bad actors, quite frankly, but also there's just not uncertain agendas in this hobby at times. And so, I think people were just cautious and guarded about what we were doing. And now we've sort of, I've met a lot of the teams. I've met with a lot of the executives at the companies and had good conversations with them. They know our intentions are strong and what we're trying to do for the hobby. And I would just, in general, I think people now give us sort of the benefit of the doubt, where maybe 4 years ago that wasn't the case. And so, from that standpoint, I just say they're easier to work with from the benefit of the doubt standpoint, and sort of their trust in what we're doing. And then, more and more we're getting companies that are volunteering information and trying to sort of not necessarily get ahead of their story, but just try to sort of help in that sense as well, which is more tooling that they can make available, or ways that they can make our jobs or lives a little bit easier, or even contextualize the things we're doing. So yeah, the short answer is definitely much more of a welcoming environment from the grading company standpoint, which is fantastic. I mean, I'd like to think that we bring more visibility, whether you're sort of performing well or sort of maybe you're having a little bit of a, adjustment period or recalibration period. We're just trying to bring more transparency. And, we could have just done PSA data forever, but without the context of other grading companies, the story would have been limited. And so even for companies, that are sort of emerging, or for PSA itself, it helps to compare and contrast against what's being seen and what's being done across the board. And so I think people understand that while they could post their own stories, having the context of what everybody else is doing also sort of facilitates just like more dialogue, more of an understanding and transparency.
Yeah, and it's nice to hear that there's some communication that goes back and forth.
Time for a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Hobby Hotline is the hobby's only live interactive call-in show. Join some of your favorite hobby personalities every Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, to discuss the hottest hobby topics. If you miss us live, catch us after the fact on all major podcast platforms. Follow us on socials at Hobby Hotline.
Sports Card Nation has returned.
I don't know if this does happen. I'll ask you. You don't even have to mention necessarily a company specifically. Does a grading company ever refute something you've reported? Like, hey, that's too high or that's too low. Like, hey, can you correct that? Or there's a discrepancy there that you need to fix. Does that ever happen or not necessarily?
A few years ago, Beckett would, offhand comment sometimes and just say, "Hey, our numbers, we feel like they're underrepresented." And candidly, they were but it's underrepresented in how they would measure it internally, not necessarily how we would view it publicly. Which is, we are literally just going to pop reports, consuming that information. We only take what the public would see to make sure that we're sort of on the same level as everybody else, and reporting that back to the hobby. And so, Beckett just has certain things where either they weren't caught up at the time, or they have BAS and certain things that just aren't as well sort of factored into how they present data on their pop reports. And so, or, even BCCG, which they grade a lot of, right? But that doesn't show up on a pop report, like a traditional pop report. And so, their volume was underrepresented to some degree versus how they might think about it internally. I think they've come to terms with they know what our approach is and sort of what we stand for and why we're doing what we're doing. And so generally speaking, I think even Beckett would agree that our narrative's generally reasonable with what is available to us. And so they were the only ones, and that was a few years ago. Otherwise, we CGC or PSA, they've mentioned us in their marketing, or, and just we partner with them in certain ways. So they're much more of, I would just say there's much more alignment of we're not going to be perfect, but we're going to put sort of, our best foot forward. And that's usually really well represented. And, we sort of stayed that course. And I think that we've built a lot of trust as a result of that. So occasionally, but it's been a few years since we've heard that.
Yeah. And I get it. And, it's not a perfect science, right? You're doing the best you can. And then when you factor in, right, people break stuff out of slabs and resub them, that can alter. You can't. That's hard. That's almost impossible, if not impossible, to track that, right? And so, I guess a question off that, Ryan. Do you ever think there'll be a day where, and it's something I rarely do personally. I think I've done it twice in 30 plus years of grading, but you think at some point, people who maybe crack it out of a slab and either resubmit it, whether it be to the same company or try to cross it over to a different one. Do you think that'll be more trackable, or for whatever technology, or that's just really hard to do?
I don't know that ever comes into play unless there's an incentive for people to report it and sort of make that more obvious to the companies. Right now, there's just, misinformation has sort of carried the hobby for decades. And so, or a lack of information. And so, that continues to be somewhat of an incentive, and that's something that we're sort of trying to counteract, which is bringing more information and making it easier to access. I would love if that were the case. It's probably the biggest pushback we get is that there's just the pop report data is not accurate, or sort of not representing sort of what the essence of it is, which is how many of these cards exist or in supply. It just actually reflects how many times it's been graded, which is not necessarily one-to-one. And there's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing the grading companies can do about it. I would love if that were the case. I don't know that there'll ever be sort of a great answer there. I think the most important thing, at some point, I'd love to bring a metric to the market of cards that might be much, more susceptible to being cracked and regraded. So people might factor in some sort of multiplier of hey, this card's 120% of sort of the realistic volume versus a card that's much more on par. Because, the cards that are the highest profile are the ones that are going to get cracked and regraded. And so the ones that people are talking about are the ones that are most susceptible to that behavior oftentimes. And so anyways, you could cherry pick that and sort of make noise about it, reasonably so, about the crack game and what that does for the numbers. But ultimately, it's something that we just want to make people aware of so that they consider it, but we're not necessarily going to solve that problem anytime soon.
Yeah, it's difficult. I get it. I've read articles where some of these grading card companies are trying to almost with an invisible ink or some sort of insignia or some kind of mark the card where it doesn't obviously ruin the card, but makes it aware that it was already graded once, and kind of track it on those terms. I mean, if something like that's ever really goes into like full effect, you think then we might see it, or even then it still becomes a difficult task?
I would, I would love to think that it's going to be productive and sort of would sort of manifest in that way or surface in that way. I mean, PSA has fingerprinting that they talk about, related to their acquisition a few years ago with Genamint, and I do think like some sort of invisible ink or something like that could be interesting, but I don't know that that's a priority for these companies, and so even if that's possible, I don't know that the companies care enough for that to be sort of something that they want to solve for at this stage. So potentially, I'd love to see something happen there. I'm not sure that that's going to be a priority anytime in the near, the next few years, but potentially that could be at least a, progress on that front.
Yeah, it's a good point you just made too, right? To implement that, you got to have the technologies, and that costs money. Like, does a grading company's going to have to want to make an investment in that, and is it worth it to them to do that? Let's say, and
Right.
those are decisions that others have to make, but. Be interesting. All the new technologies and the AIs and the all the stuff that you hear. It's going to be interesting. Where the space is going. Speaking of the grading space, again, since the last time, 2 years ago, probably more like 2.5 years ago, which again I promise won't happen again. I'm going to write 100 times. I will not have Ryan on for that amount of time. But how would you describe the grading terrain from that the last time you're here to what we're seeing now? I know that's a tough question to just a general answer, but the best you can do in 2.5 years.
No, I think it's a great question, and it shows how much how dynamic this industry is and how sort of quickly things can change. Even 2 years ago when we last chatted, SGC was just starting to build enough credibility where people were taking them serious, just from the standpoint of like, could they replace BGS as the number two? People were just unwilling to consider that even a possibility because SGC stood for sort of pre-war and vintage, and they were grading a lot of ultra modern cards all of a sudden. And, they had to build trust that was something that they were capable of doing at scale and consistently. And to their credit, they stayed the course on that. And they did some really smart programs with Topps to sort of get really great volume in the door. And they were able to replace or supplant BGS as the number two, which was really interesting. And then you flip the script, 2 years later now, and SGC's obviously been acquired and things have changed, pretty dramatically on that front, where they were sort of staying the course. They were probably tasked with not breaking things for a year, and then now you've seen sort of things pull back as the agenda has changed for collectors, the parent company of both PSA and SGC. So you've seen some changes there. So you've seen sort of what can happen when a company sort of really nails or sort of leans into a strength, which SGC was doing with service and turnaround times, and that was something that they really leaned into. You've also seen, there's just every company sort of has lanes, and what you're seeing now is more of like CGC is thriving because TCG is doing so well. To their credit, that was sort of their bread and butter. That was sort of always their sweet spot once they got integrating because of their comic lineage, and so that translated really well. And now that TCG is carrying grading in many ways, they're doing really well. PSA on a number of fronts is doing really well, and they've continued to do well. They've operated and executed extremely well since the team transitioned a few years ago. They invested a lot in infrastructure a few years ago, and they're seeing so many dividends from that and what they're doing, not only from a grading standpoint and volume standpoint, but how they actually their general understanding of like why people grade cards is a big, and this is an overgeneralization, but a lot of people grade cards to either make back money from opening wax that they lost money on, or ultimately, which is to liquidate cards, right? This is usually inventory that they no longer want to hold on to. And one of the ways to increase the value of that inventory is to grade it. And they've put a lot of pieces in place to facilitate allowing people to get the best return on their dollar when they send cards to them. And then you have somebody like Beckett on the other side of this, which is, they've stumbled, they were quiet. You didn't hear a lot happening there for a while. And, again, I think that was a company that was limited in what they could do and tasked with not breaking things because that was sort of what they were asked to do. And that was sort of the MO for a while there. I think they finally have sort of been able to revisit and sort of reimagine what that could look like, for them to be a different participant in the hobby. And you're starting to see some, tailwinds build there, which is good, because I think people love the Beckett brand. It stands for so much. And so people would love to see that brand thrive again. And so, ultimately people like having competition in our space as well. It's a constant battle. And so to the degree that a company that, especially like, even though CGC is doing well, they're still very early on the sports side of the equation. And, Beckett's a longstanding brand that people have loved over the years, and people would love to see that brand reemerge again in a way that, just it looks different. It feels different than how it has the past few years. And so there's an opportunity. So anyways, people like that. It also puts more pressure on PSA to do things. I mean, even though I just sort of spoke the graces of PSA, if you're a set registry person or you're a vintage person, you probably have all sorts of gripes with what PSA has done over the last 4 years, because it hasn't serviced sort of their most loyal audience, their core audience that built up that brand over the years. And so they've kind of pushed that aside for some initiatives to help sort of with all the ultra modern activity and the TCG activity. So you got all these different sort of moving pieces, which I think is fascinating. And it looks very different than it did just 2 years ago. And I'm willing to bet it looks pretty different 2 years from now too, even though, again, people would argue that, PSA is dominating. There's always sort of room for other players to emerge and other sort of lanes to sort of, for people, people just want to sort of, for one reason, zag against PSA or don't believe in what PSA stands for, or sort of question consistency over there because of other initiatives that they sort of prioritize. And so people are looking for alternatives. And so I just continue to think the landscape's going to evolve, which is great. I love it. It's interesting. It makes my job more interesting day in and day out. And it makes, the data that we bring to market, just continue to be well received, because it sort of continues to sort of reflect or represent sort of how things are trending, which is always interesting to see.
Yeah, it's changing, like you said, and 2 years from now it will look much different than it is as we're speaking today. Awesome reconnecting with Ryan, and again, this was part 1. So if you enjoyed it, part 2 will be next Friday. We get more into the weeds, including what his thoughts of the acquisition of SGC at the time. And that's what I love about Ryan, is he's not shy to share his kind of personal thoughts when I talk to him and when we've had him on. So that will be next week. And so we're going to hear from our Hobby is the People announcer and wrap up this week's episode.
Time for our Hobby is the People announcer of the week.
This is Ray from Philly, and remember, the hobby is the people.
If you'd like to be the Hobby is the People announcer of the week, do a WAV or MP3 file and send it to sportscardnationpc@gmail.com.